5 CFOs knew the truth. 5 CFOs signed the documents anyway. All of them were afraid. Between 1996 and 2003, 5 different men held the position of Chief Financial Officer at HealthSouth Corporation, one of the largest hospital and rehabilitation chains in the United States. Each of those 5 men, at different points during their tenure, became aware that the company's financial statements were false. Each of them was pressured, directly and personally, by the company's founder and CEO to sign off on those false statements anyway. Each of them did. Not one of them went to regulators. Not one of them went to the press. Not one of them walked away. They signed, and they stayed. Because Richard Scrushy had built something at HealthSouth that went far beyond accounting fraud. He had built a culture of fear. To understand HealthSouth, you need to understand Richard Scrushy and understand that, before the fraud, he was genuinely extraordinary. Scrushy grew up in Selma, Alabama, the son of a convenience store owner. He worked his way through school, trained as a respiratory therapist, and developed an early and accurate insight into a gap in the American healthcare market. In the 1980s, physical rehabilitation services for patients recovering from surgery, strokes, and accidents were primarily delivered in expensive inpatient hospital settings. Scrushy believed that a network of outpatient rehabilitation facilities, cheaper, more accessible, and focused specifically on the recovery journey, could serve patients better and at lower cost. He was right. In 1984, Scrushy founded HealthSouth Corporation in Birmingham, Alabama, with a handful of partners and a single rehabilitation facility. The model worked immediately. He expanded aggressively, acquiring facilities across the South, and then nationally, building what would become the largest chain of rehabilitation hospitals and outpatient surgery centers in the United States. By the late 1990s, HealthSouth operated over 2,000 facilities across all 50 states and several international locations, and employed approximately 60,000 people. It was listed on the New York Stock Exchange and was one of the most prominent healthcare companies in America. Scrushy himself became a significant public figure in Birmingham and across Alabama. He was known for his flamboyant personal style, expensive cars, a rock band he performed with, a television ministry. He was a major philanthropist, donating to universities and charities across Alabama, and serving on the boards of numerous civic organizations. He cultivated a persona that blended the charisma of an entertainer with the authority of a healthcare executive, and he wore both roles with evident comfort. He was not a quiet, modest founder. He was a showman who happened to run a hospital chain, and the performance was central to how he maintained control over his organization. That performance extended into the boardroom and the executive suite. Former executives who later cooperated with investigators described Scrushy as a dominating presence, whose approval was essential to advancement within HealthSouth, and whose disapproval could end a career. He was known for explosive outbursts in meetings when results did not meet his expectations. He demanded loyalty and rewarded it generously with compensation packages that tied executives' financial well-being closely to the company's reported performance. The structure of those incentives, bonuses and stock options that depended on HealthSouth meeting earnings targets that Scrushy set, created powerful personal financial motivations for the senior team to ensure those targets were met, whether the underlying business justified them or not. The first decision to falsify HealthSouth's accounts, investigators concluded, was made by Scrushy when the company's actual earnings fell short of what Wall Street analysts expected. Rather than report the shortfall and manage the market's expectations downward, Scrushy instructed his CFO to make the numbers work. It was a decision he would make again every quarter for the next 7 years, and each time the CFO who carried it out understood that their job, and Scrushy's approval, depended on compliance. The mechanics of the HealthSouth fraud were straightforward in design, but extraordinary in what they revealed about how fear operates inside large organizations. Each quarter, when HealthSouth's actual financial results fell short of what analysts expected, a small group of senior accounting executives, known within the company as the family, would gather to determine how large the gap was and how to fill it. The gap was filled by creating fictitious journal entries that inflated revenues and understated expenses. The adjustments were allocated across HealthSouth's many facilities in amounts small enough that no individual facility's numbers would appear obviously wrong. The whole was fraudulent. The parts were individually defensible. The CFO's role in this process was to review, approve, and certify the adjusted numbers as accurate in the financial statements filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission. This certification became the moment of maximum personal exposure for each CFO, the point at which they personally attested to the accuracy of numbers they knew to be false. Each of the 5 CFOs who occupied the role between 1996 and 2003 described, in their subsequent cooperation agreements with prosecutors, the same essential experience of learning what was happening and being confronted with the choice of whether to comply or refuse. The pressure Scrushy applied was not always explicit. It did not need to be. Former CFOs described meetings with Scrushy in which the expectations were communicated through implication and intensity, rather than direct instruction, through his evident displeasure when results were discussed honestly, through the stories that circulated internally about what happened to executives who disappointed him, and through the visible consequences for those who had crossed him professionally. Several described a sense of isolation once they understood what was happening, a feeling that the only people they could talk to about it were the people who were already involved, and that any external disclosure would destroy not only their career, but potentially result in legal consequences for their own prior compliance. The 5th CFO, William Owens, was the one who broke the pattern. In 2002, following the passage of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which imposed personal criminal liability on executives who certified false financial statements, Owens approached the FBI. He agreed to cooperate and, in a remarkable act of personal courage, wore a wire to meetings with Scrushy and other HealthSouth executives, recording conversations in which the fraud was discussed. The recordings that Owens produced became the centerpiece of the government's case against Scrushy. They were, by the standards of white-collar criminal evidence, extraordinarily direct. Conversations in which the falsification of accounts was discussed not as a hypothetical, but as an operational matter being managed in real time. The total amount of fraud that investigators ultimately identified in HealthSouth's accounts was approximately $2.7 billion, accumulated over approximately 7 years. 15 HealthSouth executives, including all 5 CFOs, eventually pleaded guilty to criminal charges related to the fraud. Every person who had been in the room when the numbers were adjusted, with the sole exception of Richard Scrushy himself, either pleaded guilty or cooperated with prosecutors. Here is the part that nobody saw coming. 15 people pleaded guilty. The wire recordings were played in open court. The evidence was overwhelming. And then the jury acquitted Richard Scrushy on all counts. Every single one. Stay with me, because this is where it gets truly extraordinary. The trial of Richard Scrushy began in January 2005 in Birmingham, Alabama, a deliberate venue choice by the defense that would prove to be one of the most consequential strategic decisions in the history of American white-collar criminal defense. Scrushy's legal team successfully argued that the trial should be held in Birmingham, where HealthSouth was headquartered, and where Scrushy was a dominant civic figure, rather than in a more neutral federal venue. Birmingham was Scrushy's home territory in every sense that mattered. In the months leading up to the trial, Scrushy made a calculated and highly visible pivot in his public persona. He began attending a predominantly Black Baptist church in Birmingham, a congregation he had had no previous relationship with, and he became a prominent and generous presence there. He donated money, he appeared regularly, and he gave interviews in which he spoke about his faith and his relationship with God. The pastor of the church became a vocal public supporter. The transformation was observed with considerable skepticism by commentators and prosecutors, who characterized it as a transparently strategic effort to cultivate goodwill among Black voters who were likely to be heavily represented on a Birmingham jury. Whether the characterization was fair or not, the calculation proved to be correct. The prosecution's case was substantial. The wire recordings that William Owens had made were played in court. 15 former HealthSouth executives testified against Scrushy, each describing specific interactions with him in which the falsification of accounts had been discussed or directed. The paper trail was extensive. The forensic accounting evidence was detailed. On the face of the documentary and testimonial record, the case for Scrushy's guilt was overwhelming. Scrushy's defense relied on a counter-narrative that proved remarkably effective. His lawyers argued that HealthSouth's accounting department had been running the fraud without Scrushy's knowledge, that the CEO of a company as large as HealthSouth could not be expected to have direct oversight of every accounting decision made by his finance team, and that the testimony of 15 witnesses who had all pleaded guilty and were testifying in exchange for leniency should be viewed with deep skepticism. Each of those witnesses had their own incentive to implicate Scrushy, the defense argued, and each of them had made their own choices to participate in the fraud. Scrushy, his lawyers contended, was the target rather than the architect. In June 2005, the jury returned not guilty verdicts on all 85 counts against Scrushy. The verdict stunned federal prosecutors, legal analysts, and the business community. It was the first time a CEO had been acquitted of all charges brought under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which had been specifically designed to ensure that executives who certified false financial statements could be held personally accountable. The acquittal was celebrated by Scrushy's supporters and criticized intensely by those who argued that the jury's deliberations had been influenced more by Scrushy's community profile and his church affiliations than by the evidence presented at trial. The acquittal of Richard Scrushy in the HealthSouth fraud trial proved to be not the end of his legal troubles, but a pause before a different and ultimately more consequential set of charges. In 2006, less than a year after his acquittal in Birmingham, Scrushy was convicted in a separate federal case in Montgomery, Alabama, on charges of bribery and conspiracy. The charges arose from his relationship with Don Siegelman, the former governor of Alabama. Prosecutors alleged that Scrushy had donated $500,000 to a lottery education fund that Siegelman supported, and that in return he had been appointed to a seat on the Alabama Certificate of Need Review Board, a regulatory body that had significant authority over healthcare facility approvals in the state, directly affecting HealthSouth's ability to open and expand facilities. Scrushy was convicted on 6 counts of bribery and conspiracy and sentenced to nearly 7 years in federal prison. The irony that the man who had avoided conviction for a $2.7 billion accounting fraud was ultimately imprisoned for a $500,000 political bribe was not lost on legal commentators, prosecutors, or the public. He reported to prison in 2007 and served approximately 6.5 years before being released in 2012. The consequences for HealthSouth as a company were severe, but ultimately survivable. The company, which had gone through a bankruptcy-adjacent restructuring process under new management following Scrushy's removal, eventually rebuilt under the leadership of Jay Grinney, who became CEO in 2004 and oversaw years of genuine operational and financial recovery. HealthSouth was eventually rebranded as Encompass Health in 2018, a name change intended to create distance from the fraud era and signal a new corporate identity. The company today remains one of the largest providers of rehabilitation hospital services in the United States, a testament to the genuine value that Scrushy had originally identified in the rehabilitation services market, even as everything he built to describe and report that value had been fraudulent. The 5 CFOs who had signed the false documents received sentences that reflected both their cooperation with prosecutors and their own substantial guilt. Sentences range from probation to several years in prison, with the length reflecting the degree of cooperation each individual provided and the duration of their participation in the scheme. All of them lost their professional certifications and their careers in accounting and finance. The HealthSouth case is remembered today primarily for 2 things: the number of people who knew and stayed silent, and the acquittal that should not have happened. It is a case that tests every assumption about how justice functions in complex fraud prosecutions, about the role of community standing in jury deliberations, about the limits of even overwhelming evidence when defense lawyers are skilled enough and venue choices are smart enough, and about the arbitrary quality of the legal system when the same man can be acquitted of a $2.7 billion fraud and then convicted of a $500,000 bribe. The law reached Scrushy eventually. It just reached him for the wrong crime. Before we finish, drop one word in the comments. If you had been one of those 5 CFOs, knowing what you knew, working for someone like Scrushy, do you think you would have signed? One word. Yes or no? Because most people think they know the answer until they're in the room. I read every single one. 15 people knew. 1 finally spoke. The next case we're covering, nobody spoke at all for 30 years. Subscribe, because that one is harder to explain than this one.